Hi, this is David Miller, and I'm here with the second in a series of mini lectures on Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Today we're going to talk about patriarchal families, the historical context for Shakespeare's play. The description of this course, you might remember, promises that we're going to look at how family structures are related to larger social structures. In Romeo and Juliet, the larger political unit is the Italian city-state of Verona, ruled by a prince. The great households of this city, the Montagues and the Capulets and their ilk, are semi-autonomous, subject to the authority of the prince, but ruled internally by patriarchs. The highest rank of the social hierarchy thus consists of multiple houses that are relatively independent but are connected by networks of kinship and what was called patronage, something like sponsorship. The prince himself belongs to this network. At the end of the play, he refers to his own loss of a brace of kinsmen, by which he means Mercutio and Paris. It seems likely that one reason Capulet might have found Paris an appealing match for Juliet is not only his rank as Count or County Paris, but also his alliance with the prince. By giving his daughter to Paris, Capulet would be linking his household to the dominant kin group in the city. Shakespeare's play asks us to see the patriarchal household within a network of households structured by the forces of alliance and rivalry. You may wonder what all this has to do with Shakespeare's young lovers, but I'm going to argue that to understand Romeo and Juliet as individuals, to see their tragedy clearly for what it is, we have to understand the world they inhabit. That's going to be my argument across this series of mini lectures on the play. The city of Verona is in many ways an image of Shakespeare's England. To see what Shakespeare and his audience saw in the story of Romeo and Juliet, it's important to realize that the structure of the family in the upper ranks of English society was changing, slowly but surely, away from an older form and toward a more modern one. The social historian Lawrence Stone calls these templates the open lineage family and the restricted patriarchal nuclear family. That last one's a bit of a mouthful, but if you look at each of the terms separately, they do make sense. Stone estimates the historical lifespan of the open lineage family to have extended from about 1450 to 1640, with the restricted patriarchal nuclear family extending from about 1560 to 1700. The transition period from 1560 to 1640 is where the two types overlap. Shakespeare's theatrical career began around 1590 and ended around 1610 or 12, so it occupies the exact middle of the transitional period Stone describes. To see Romeo and Juliet as a story about family, then, we can't simply view it in a static way, as reflecting a single, stable family structure in English society. We need to see it as a story about change. So what about these family types? What did they look like? And what did change at this level have to do with changing forms of social and political organization? Here's a comparison that shows the differences in the structure, core values, social organization, focal point of loyalty, basis of social identity, and historical context for each family type. The open lineage family placed more emphasis on the larger kinship network and less on the core or nucleus of the immediate family. It valued property and status over intimacy and found its place within a society organized by lineage families rather than by citizenship. Loyalty therefore tended to be local, attached to regional networks of kinship and clientage, as opposed to the mutually reinforcing loyalties to the nation-state embodied in the monarch and the nuclear family ruled by the father. In the open lineage family, social identity derives exclusively from one's place in the kinship system, whereas the growth of a national bureaucracy created powerful alternative ways of establishing a social identity, the office one held, for instance, or the profession one practiced. Finally, the open lineage family thrived in a static social hierarchy based primarily on an agrarian economy. The powerful elites were landholders. The restricted patriarchal nuclear family navigated between a world of increasing social mobility, in which mercantile capitalism was driving a wedge between traditional forms of status and newer sources of wealth. These changes went hand in hand with a transformation of the larger political structure as the medieval kingdom gave way to the modern nation-state, which in its first phase was characterized by the emergence of absolute monarchy. This means that as the basis of social identity was shifting from regional networks to a national state symbolized by the monarch, the basis of political power was also shifting, with the traditional aristocracy and their regional power bases weakening gradually as the monarch and the royal court in London gained power. These sorts of contrasts are helpful because they're relatively clear, but you have to keep in mind that this schematic clarity is a result of hindsight. During the period of transition, the fading older model is still powerfully present, while the emerging newer model isn't yet fully in place. It is therefore a period characterized precisely by its confusion about the very contrasts that a chart like the one I just showed you clarifies so neatly in retrospect. And Shakespeare's play is located right at the heart of this confusion. It gives us the kind of access that only literature can to the lived experience of confusion, contradiction, and conflict. Along with this broad set of changes, there are three more specific topics that it helps to know a little bit about as we approach the play: marriage, child-rearing practices, and the effect on family life of the Protestant Reformation. What is marriage? That's still a hot topic, so it's worth knowing a little bit about the history of this institution. In 16th century England, no less than today, the definition was changing along with the structure of the family. And so the change from regarding marriage as, first of all, an arrangement that serves property to, first of all, an emotional bond, that's part of the historical transition that we're looking at. Modern churches treat marriage as a sacrament, but the medieval church didn't really gain control over marriage, along with the related concepts of adultery, divorce, fornication, and legitimacy, until the late Middle Ages, around the 13th century. By the 16th century in England, a marriage among the propertied classes normally developed in 5 stages. Step 2, the formal betrothal, had binding force. If followed by cohabitation, step 5, the oral promise before witnesses constituted a valid marriage in the eyes of the law. And this is because the oath before witnesses was also an oath before God and was considered to be sacred. Now, obviously the fact that betrothals between younger children were not uncommon at this time could create problems. The children of wealthy and powerful families might cause serious political difficulties by binding themselves in unsanctioned unions, if, for example, an heiress eloped or were kidnapped. Laws were enacted to try and prevent such developments, but because the oath before God was sacred, it trumped parliamentary statutes. This meant that for a period of about 150 years, it was possible for a marriage to be illegal but still binding. The situation was much simpler with divorce. It consisted only in separation without remarriage. One important change during the transitional period between family types was a gradual increase in the child's power of choice. This power began as something like a veto. Parents might present prospective partners to their children, but the children might be permitted to refuse. In Shakespeare's play, Juliet seems at first to be permitted such a power of veto, but then her father turns back to the older custom. It's interesting that Capulet does this after Tybalt has been slain. He abruptly becomes rigid and reverts to tradition when the prestige of his household has been weakened by the death of a young male dependent. When Juliet challenges his authority, his reaction is defensive and violent. Many of the changes we're considering were driven by the Protestant Reformation in England. The spiritual emphasis on damnation, for example, got new momentum from the reformers' drive to combat original sin in children. In other ways as well, religious reform was tied to a program of reforming family life. Specifically, there was an ideological campaign to reinforce the father's role as spiritual head of the household. Juliet goes to confession with a priest, but English children of Reformed families would be led by their fathers in family prayer at home. As absolute monarchy increasingly centralized political power within the state, so the father's role as head of household centralized authority within the family, and these two developments reinforced each other, as when King James insisted that the people were his children, and he their lawful father. These developments tended to weaken the extended kinship network from both sides, shifting its political power to the national regime while weakening its influence on the family. And this meant that there would be fewer external checks on a father's authority within the family. In the open lineage family, the mother had had her own allies within the kinship network, and the church as an institution had authority over certain aspects of family life. Both forces were weakened by the Reformation as the father's role was strengthened. Changes in the law of inheritance further increased the father's control over how his estate would be disposed. This gave the father more control even over adult children. Okay, next time we're going to go back to Shakespeare's play. So as you finish reading the play, think about how what you've learned about the historical context might change your sense of the action and the protagonists.